among all the invisible burdens a human soul must carry through the long corridor of living, perhaps none is more ancient, more tender, or more sorrow-laden than the burden of destiny. It is because of destiny that one person smiles through tears, while another spends a lifetime listening to the echo of a door that once closed softly and never opened again. There are meetings so brief they seem almost to vanish as soon as they appear, and yet they leave behind the feeling of something immeasurably old, as though two souls, separated by time and reborn into unfamiliar names, had somehow recognized one another in passing. And there are companionships that stretch across years, even decades, only to dissolve at last into the quiet revelation that what once seemed enduring was only a season wearing the costume of permanence. So much of human life unfolds between these two mysteries, arrival and departure. We are forever meeting, forever losing, forever trying to understand why one hand remains in ours, while another slips beyond our reach. We give names to these movements: love, fate, loss, betrayal, providence, chance. Yet none of these names is large enough. Beneath them all moves something older, deeper, more difficult to enclose in language. The hidden law by which things come to us, and the equally hidden law by which they are taken away. And because the human heart was not fashioned merely to witness, but to attach, suffering begins almost at once. The heart does not simply receive what is beautiful, it kneels before it. It does not merely cherish, it clings. It does not quietly say, "This has been given," but trembles and insists, "This must remain." Thus, sorrow is born not only from loss itself, but from the silent, desperate argument we carry on with impermanence. We grieve because something has ended, but we suffer more deeply because some part of us refuses to believe that ending could belong to the order of things. Yet what if impermanence is not the cruelty of life, but one of its deepest truths? What if endings do not arrive to humiliate love, but to reveal its hidden depth? What if letting go is not the burial of meaning, but its refinement? What if the things that pass through us most painfully are not necessarily the things that diminish us, but the very things that widen our interior life and prepare us for another order of wisdom? These questions do not come early to most of us. In youth, we tend to believe in the innocence of permanence. We imagine that what touches us deeply will remain with us, simply because it has touched us deeply. We assume that intensity guarantees duration. If something is sincere, we think it should last. If something is beautiful, we think it should be spared from transience. If love is real, we think it ought to overcome time, misunderstanding, distance, fatigue, circumstance, and the thousand subtle erosions that work quietly upon human bonds. But life is not arranged according to the logic of our longing. It does not preserve a thing merely because we have loved it well. It does not always honor our devotion with continuity. It often gives without promising to keep giving. It often places in our hands what it never intended for us to hold forever. And because of this, many of the deepest lessons of adulthood begin not in attainment, but in relinquishment, not in possession, but in the moment when possession becomes impossible, and the soul must decide whether it will harden, collapse, or be transformed. To let go is often mistaken for weakness by those who have not yet understood the dignity of surrender. We imagine that release is what happens when feeling has grown shallow, when courage has failed, when devotion no longer has the strength to endure. But this is one of the heart's oldest misunderstandings. There are moments when holding on requires far less bravery than loosening the hand. There are sorrows we preserve not because they are sacred, but because they are familiar. We remain faithful to old pain because it gives us the illusion of connection. We clutch broken things because to lay them down would require us to enter the fearful openness of a life remade. And so many wander through the years carrying ruins as though they were relics. They return in thought to what has already departed, rehearse old words until memory becomes a chamber without air, keep vigil before a door that time itself has sealed. They call this loyalty. They call it love. But often it is only grief that has forgotten how to move. It is only attachment dressing itself in noble language so that it need not confess how frightened it is of emptiness. How many people remain inwardly chained to what is no longer present? How many sit beside the ashes of an old season, naming their inability to move forward faithfulness? How many continue to bleed from a wound, not because the wound is still open, but because they revisit it, touch it, narrate it, and refuse to allow the body of the soul to do what all living bodies must do? Heal by degrees, scar with dignity, and continue onward, altered but alive? For true love, when ripened by wisdom, does not always insist on possession. It learns, slowly and at great cost, another language, the language of blessing. It learns to say, "This passed through my life, and because it did, I was changed." It learns to bow before what was given, even when it cannot remain. It learns that not every flower is meant to become fruit, and not every dawn is promised to become day. Some things exist to awaken the soul for a moment only, and their brevity does not make them less holy. A blossom scattered by the wind is not a failed blossom. A song that ends is not a false song. Beauty does not owe us duration in order to be real. This is difficult wisdom because the ego measures value in permanence, but the soul often discovers value in transformation. The ego wants continuity, confirmation, possession, guarantee. The soul, if it grows honest enough, begins to understand that many of the most sacred experiences of life cannot be kept in their original form. They can only be received, suffered, remembered, and transmuted into understanding. We do not always get to keep the people, places, seasons, identities, and certainties that once made us feel most alive. Sometimes all we are given to keep is the inward change they created in us, and sometimes that change is the truest gift. There is, too, another root from which suffering rises: desire, that restless fire hidden beneath so much of what we call ambition, hope, romance, grief, longing, and despair. To desire is human. To yearn is woven into the very fabric of our being. We are creatures forever leaning toward something, toward love, toward fulfillment, toward recognition, toward understanding, toward the mirage of a future in which all inner hunger will at last be stilled. There is nothing shameful in this. Desire is not in itself the enemy. It is often the very force that moves us toward beauty, toward growth, toward creation, toward communion. But desire becomes sorrow when it hardens into demand. When we no longer say, "I hope," but "this must be." When we no longer receive life as a mystery, but attempt to seize it by the throat and force it into the shape of our expectations. When we can no longer distinguish between what we deeply wish for and what we are entitled to keep. How much pain is born not from what has been withheld, but from our refusal to accept the timing, the form, or the limits of what is given? We want love before it ripens, certainty before it reveals itself, healing before grief has spoken its full name. We want the answer before the question has finished unfolding. We want the fruit before its sweetness has formed. We drink too soon from the cup and then wonder why our mouths are burned. We ask the world to satisfy the soul on our schedule, and when it does not, we accuse life of cruelty, not seeing that much of our torment lies in our insistence. This insistence enters every region of experience. It enters our relationships when we ask another person to carry the weight of our emptiness. It enters our ambitions when we believe that achievement will settle an inward unrest that is, in truth, spiritual rather than professional. It enters our grief when we demand not to suffer, as though love could exist without vulnerability. It enters even our search for peace when we want serenity as a possession rather than as a practice of surrender. There is profound mercy in learning to release this insistence, not to cease longing, but to loosen the knot that binds our peace to outcomes, not to renounce beauty, but to stop demanding that beauty obey us, not to become indifferent, but to become inwardly spacious. Peace does not arrive when every wish has been answered. Peace arrives when the soul no longer bargains with reality for the right to be whole. And this peace, so sought, so postponed, so often mistaken for some distant reward, is far quieter and nearer than most imagine. It is not the triumph of having arranged life perfectly. It is not the glittering moment when sorrow is finally banished and everything broken is restored. It is not a grand climax in which all contradictions vanish. Peace begins much more humbly. It begins when the heart ceases its struggle against what has already been written. It begins when one sits in the presence of loss without trying to turn it into something else. It begins when one breathes and in breathing consents, if only for a moment, to the truth of things. To consent is not to collapse. It is not resignation in the barren sense. It is a form of inner nobility. It is the soul's quiet acknowledgement that the river will not reverse for our sake, and that wisdom lies not in commanding the current, but in learning how to stand within it without being torn apart. There is courage in such standing. There is even a kind of splendor in it, for the one who no longer wages war against impermanence becomes spacious. That person carries grief without becoming identical to grief, remembers without drowning, loves without chaining, hopes without pleading. This spaciousness is one of the most difficult attainments of a mature life. It cannot be achieved by theory alone. It is not something we inherit merely by reading wise books or hearing noble sentences. It is hammered into us by experience. It is shaped in the long apprenticeship of disappointment, in the disciplines of mourning, in the repeated discovery that control is smaller than we imagined and reality larger. It comes when we have exhausted ourselves trying to force life into compliance and begin, at last, to ask a different question. Not, how do I make this stay? But, how do I live truthfully when it cannot? Once this question awakens in us, everything begins to look different. Then each meeting, however brief, is no longer judged only by how long it lasted, but by what it awakened. Each parting, however painful, is no longer only an injury, but also an initiation. Then regret begins to soften into reverence. One ceases asking only, why was this taken from me? And begins, with trembling humility, to ask instead, what was this given to teach me? In that question, suffering is not erased, but transfigured. It becomes part of the soul's education, part of the hidden architecture by which a human being is hollowed, widened, and made capable of greater tenderness. And tenderness, contrary to what the world often imagines, is not fragility. It is not naivete. It is not the softness of someone untouched by loss. True tenderness is forged in those who have suffered enough to know the cost of hardness. It belongs to those who could have become bitter and did not. It belongs to those who have watched things vanish and still retain the ability to bless. It belongs to those who understand that if pain is allowed to teach only suspicion, then pain has conquered too much. The past, too, changes its nature when held by a wiser heart. Memory need not remain a place of imprisonment. It can become, instead, something like a winter garden, bare perhaps, but still inhabited by fragrance. Old griefs, old loves, old faces once luminous with presence may remain within us like dried petals between the pages of a long-closed book, fragile, faded, and yet still carrying something of their first sweetness. To remember in this way is one of the heart's most difficult arts. Not to deny, not to romanticize, not to bleed endlessly from what is over, but to let memory ripen into gentleness. There are memories that first arrive like knives and later return like lamps. There are names that once undid us and later become part of the inward landscape through which we walk with gratitude rather than ache. There are former selves we once pitied or condemned who later appear to us with compassion, as though time had finally taught us how to look upon our own unfinishedness with mercy. This transformation of memory is not forgetfulness. It is not coldness. It is the healing of perspective. It is what happens when the soul ceases to use the past as an instrument of self-punishment. A memory held unwisely becomes a chain. A memory held wisely becomes a witness. It reminds us not only of what we lost, but of what we survived, what we learned, what we became capable of understanding because of it. At the end of all striving, what does the heart truly seek? Not victory, perhaps, not applause, not the admiration of the crowd, not even happiness in the shallow sense by which the world so often measures a life. Beneath all ambition, all longing, all resistance, the heart seeks one thing only: peace. A place within itself where it can finally stop fleeing. A stillness not dependent on possession. A freedom not shattered by change. This is why so many outer attainments fail to satisfy the inward life. We collect achievements and still feel pursued by unrest. We accumulate experiences and still feel hungry. We gather approval and still feel strangely unseen. We build identities and still feel that something essential remains unanchored. It is not because these things are worthless, but because none of them can answer the deepest need of the soul. The soul does not finally ask, "How much have I gained?" It asks, "Can I rest?" It does not ask, "How admired am I?" but, "Am I reconciled with the conditions of being human?" And perhaps the deepest doorway into that peace is the ancient and radiant wisdom of enough. To know enough sorrow, enough striving, enough desire, enough acquisition. To come at last to that inward threshold where the soul says, "I do not need the world to become larger for my life to become whole." This is not defeat. It is abundance of the rarest kind. For the one who knows what is enough is no longer tormented by endless hunger. Such a person may live simply, may go unnoticed by history, may possess little in the eyes of others, and yet inwardly dwell in a kingdom greater than any built of gold. To know enough is to rediscover the sacredness of ordinary things. A bowl of warm rice, a window lit by late afternoon, the sound of rain on a quiet roof, the familiar silence between two people who no longer need to prove their love with words, the smell of books in an old room, the slow companionship of evening light across a floor. The world returns then, no longer as a field of lack, but as a place shimmering with sufficiency. And the soul, released from its fever of comparison and demand, begins at last to rest. This wisdom of enough is among the hardest to acquire because the world is organized around dissatisfaction. Everything around us whispers that fulfillment lies elsewhere, in more acclaim, more beauty, more security, more romance, more certainty, more accumulation, more youth, more achievement, more proof that we have not been forgotten. We are trained to live as if peace were always one possession, one recognition, one repaired wound, one final resolution away. But the soul matures when it sees through this endless deferral. It matures when it realizes that life cannot be lived from the horizon alone. At some point, One must learn to inhabit the present not as a compromise, but as the only place where grace can actually be received. And grace is almost always quieter than our fantasies. It does not always arrive as rescue. It often arrives as clarity, as simplification, as the sudden willingness to stop pretending, as the courage to admit that a chapter has ended, as the humility to bless what could not stay, as the strange calm that comes after tears have exhausted their argument, as the realization that one can be wounded and still remain open, as the discovery that life, though altered, has not ended with the ending of what we loved. Perhaps this is what life, in all its hidden severity and tenderness, has been trying to teach us from the beginning. That fullness does not come from grasping more fiercely, but from holding more lightly. That freedom is not the absence of love, but love without chains. That peace is not found at the end of a flawless life, but in the heart that has ceased demanding that life be flawless before it agrees to be grateful. So when something beloved leaves, when a season closes before we are ready, when the hand we had hoped to hold forever slips back into the great anonymity from which all things come and go, perhaps we are not being asked to become harder. Perhaps we are being invited into a greater softness, a deeper seeing, to bow before transience not with despair, but with reverence, to bless what was, to release what is gone, to remain open to what still waits quietly beyond the edge of our sorrow. For in the end, it is not our grip that saves us. It is our grace. It is not how tightly we held, but how deeply we loved. Not how long we possessed, but how gently we released. Not how much the world gave us, but whether, amid all its vanishing, we learned at last to keep a peaceful heart. And that peaceful heart, light enough to love, spacious enough to lose, and still remain tender before the mystery of life, is perhaps the closest thing on earth to freedom. For freedom is not merely the removal of burdens. It is not simply the power to choose among options. It is not even the absence of pain. The deepest freedom is inward, the freedom of not having one's soul chained to what must change. The freedom of loving without making an idol of permanence. The freedom of remembering without being ruled by memory. The freedom of participating fully in the fragile beauty of existence while knowing that fragility is part of its beauty and not a defect in it. This freedom does not make us less human. It makes us more fully human. For what is humanity, if not the strange vocation of learning how to inhabit a vanishing world without despair? What is wisdom, if not the art of remaining tender in a reality where everything we touch bears the mark of time? What is maturity, if not the slow conversion of attachment into reverence, of desire into discernment, of grief into depth, of memory into blessing? In the end, perhaps the soul does not become luminous by escaping sorrow, but by passing through sorrow without losing its capacity for wonder. Perhaps the highest form of understanding is not mastery, but gentleness. Perhaps the final lesson is not how to possess life, but how to receive it with open hands, knowing it cannot be kept, and loving it all the more because of that. And so the heart, after much resisting, much longing, much grieving, much learning, comes at last to a quieter threshold. There it discovers that letting go is not a fall into emptiness, but an entrance into spaciousness. Not a betrayal of love, but its purification. Not the end of meaning, but its deepening. There, at last, the soul becomes capable of saying yes to life without demanding guarantees from it. And in that yes, humble, bruised, lucid and free, there is peace. In the end, perhaps the deepest wisdom life offers is not how to hold on, but how to release without bitterness. Not how to avoid sorrow, but how to let sorrow refine rather than harden the soul. For no one passes through this world untouched. We all love what we cannot keep. We all lose what we once believed would remain. We all stand, at one hour or another, before the quiet ruins of an expectation, a relationship, a season, or a former self, and must learn how to continue. Yet to continue is not merely to endure. It is to awaken. It is to understand, little by little, that life was never asking us to become owners of what is passing, but caretakers of what is briefly and beautifully given. We were not placed here to imprison love, nor to command time, nor to build permanence out of fragile things. We were placed here to witness, to cherish, to bless, and when the hour comes, to loosen our hands with grace. This is not an easy wisdom. It is purchased through disappointment, silence, waiting, and tears. It ripens in those who have been humbled by impermanence and yet have not turned away from life. It belongs to those who have discovered that peace does not lie in forcing the world to remain, but in allowing the heart to become spacious enough to meet change without collapse. Such a heart does not become cold. On the contrary, it becomes warmer, gentler, more merciful. Having suffered, it no longer wishes to add unnecessary suffering to itself or to others. And so the journey of the soul may be understood not as a conquest, but as a softening. We begin by grasping, demanding, fearing, and dividing the world into what must stay and what must never leave. But as life teaches us, through loss, through love, through longing, through the slow undoing of certainty, we begin to see differently. We begin to understand that beauty is not diminished by its passing, that love is not made false by its ending, and that memory need not be a prison if it is carried with reverence instead of desperation. At last, one arrives at a quieter understanding that peace is not found somewhere beyond life's changes, but in the very heart that has learned to move among them without losing its center, to know enough, to bless what came, to release what has gone, to remain open to what still waits in unseen form. This is no small achievement. It is a kind of inward grace. It is a form of freedom. For what remains when so much has come and gone? Not the certainty that we once demanded, not the permanence we once begged for. What remains is the quality of our seeing, the tenderness we preserved, the truthfulness with which we loved, the dignity with which we let go, the peace we were able, despite everything, to keep alive within ourselves, And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is more than enough. For a life well lived is not one that escaped loss, but one that was deepened by it. A heart made wise is not one that never broke, but one that broke and still chose gentleness. And a soul nearing freedom is not one that possesses all it desires, but one that has learned in humility and wonder to rest in what is. So let the world come as it comes. Let it bloom, let it fade, let it wound, let it bless. And let the heart, through all its seasons, learn this final and quiet art. To love fully, to cling lightly, and to depart from each passing moment with gratitude.